Okay, we are back on part 2. I hope everyone wrote down what he or she thinks is the purpose of Apple. And we have a little hint, so the slogan already tells it a bit, no? The famous slogan was always think different. And this is actually the why. And now it's a bit also tricky. So what was meant? And I think the core, the soul of the company, the really inner purpose is really well described by this movie. In the first version, Steve Jobs himself spoke the text, and then afterwards in the TV version, the text was said by an actor called Richard Dreyfuss. But it's a movie from 1997. And all Apple fans love it. And you may also know these famous lines. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, people who are different. So this is actually the core. They wanted to have creative people that are doing things differently. So the why, the purpose of Apple is actually challenging the status quo, doing things differently. And then they were thinking, okay, how should we do things differently? And the how is then just simply, okay, we make products that are easy to use and beautifully designed. That is their how. And if you think about, okay, why are we here? Why do we as a company exist? We exist to challenge the status quo, and we produce products that are simple and beautiful. So here you see that the product is not yet included. So the product is the outer ring, the outer circle, the what, the result. And as a result, they, for example, produce computers or tablets or iPads, iPhones, and so forth. And the really important thing is that Apple does not define itself as a hardware or a software company, but they define themselves as a company that is doing things differently. It's a leader. We are doing things better in a different way. And that is also, there's a very famous story from a taxi driver who was driving once an Apple employee and also a Microsoft employee at the other time, both from the top management. And they realized Microsoft did not really have a strategy because their only goal was to outperform Apple. So they really looked at the competitor and wanted to become as good as a competitor. So they didn't really have an identity. They just were looking around and tried to be market leader. And you still see that in a lot of strategies. So most of the strategies I've seen personally, there was one sentence at the top that is, being the market leader in the construction market in Germany, and that's the strategy. But it's not a strategy. It's not a why. It's not a how. It's not a positioning. It's not saying what you don't do. So you can forget about that. Also, a lot of them say, oh, we want to be amongst the top 10 global leaders in whatever market, selling customer-friendly, high-quality, innovative products. Again, this is nothing. And if you look at Apple, that says, okay, we want to make a difference. We want to challenge the status quo with simple, beautifully designed products, then you have a differentiation. And this is also why people say, okay, Apple was so successful, because they positioned themselves with a clear why and a differentiation from others in the market. And this is also why people say, okay, they have more or less a 40% profit margin with their smartphones, so their mobile phones, and this is much bigger, 40%, than others in the industry who earn maybe a gross margin of 10 or 20%. And as said, the why, the strategy is one of the core reasons. Another example I brought to you is Tom's. So they are a shoe manufacturer. And the interesting thing about their business model is that they sell one pair of shoes. And you see that here on the left-hand side with the picture, 1 for 1 is a slogan. And you see also here the founder who gives shoes to this kid. So they said there's a lot of kids, especially in the global south, that are not having enough money to buy shoes. And so they had this social purpose, this social impact at the core of their business. They did not want to sell shoes just to sell shoes. So this would be the what. But their core, their why was really at the center, and this was the social impact. So they really wanted to create social impact and to improve people's lives and create more social justice in the world. And this is what was really making them famous and really, really successful. And it was quite interesting. I put you also on Moodle an article from the Harvard Business Review, which describes the founder's story really nicely, that the purpose, the why, was very predominant in the beginning. And then after a while, they were so successful that they were just focusing on their operations. How can we ensure to increase production? How can we optimize our logistics and so forth? So they were really managing and not remembering their why anymore. And so the founder felt really empty and he felt something was missing. And then he realized, okay, they have to get back to this why. And then they did a lot of additional ideas, product ideas, and also actions in order to support their initial purpose again. So that's also a really nice company example where you have a shoe business not defining themselves as a shoe business at the what, but at the why they exist to improve people's lives. All right, so this is also how you can define strategy. And what I would like you to do next is that you stop the video and you take maybe 20, 30, or 40 minutes to rethink about the strategy of Sonax. So what you have on Moodle is a corporate presentation. I provided you the link to the website, also the link to a customer video. And I would love that you really go through these things quite quickly, but really absorb every indication you see, any strategic direction, any vision, any mission, any why. So any kind of purpose or goals, values, whatever you think, and wherever you find evidence, you just write a little note. And then as a second step, try to identify the strategic intent. What will happen is that in the next weeks, also Sonax themselves, they will provide us and talk about their strategy. But I'm really curious, and it's really important that you do the first step, right? Try to find evidence and try to define their strategic intent just from the materials. And afterwards, when they explain, you can see, okay, did you find what they say or did you find something different? And afterwards, during the project, when you work on it, and then at the end, you can also reflect again, like, what would you propose? them to do. Maybe it's aligned with their current strategy, or maybe you think they need a different kind of strategy. All right, so you can pause now, do the exercise, and then you can continue with the video. All right, so next chapter is the inspection. So inspection actually means analysis. And once you've defined the strategic direction, the strategic intent of the company, you can go into the details and first of all understand everything in the inspection phase. Before then, afterwards, you define the strategy and then you have to implement the strategy. So looking at this here, you see there is the mega trends here listed. So it's quite interesting. Here we have the mega trends map of the Future Institute at the German Institute. But you find these from hundreds or thousands of consultancies, a little bit always differently shown, but at the end it's always the same. I like this tube map a lot because it shows how these are intertwined and how these are interconnected, and that's quite interesting to see. A megatrend is a long-term structural change which really affects all the industries globally. So it's changes like climate change, digitalization, demographics, and all of these things you see here. So it's about new work, health, mobility, female shift, connectivity, globalization, individualization, and so forth. And you see always on every track you have two ends. And it's quite interesting how the different elements of these tracks look like. So it's quite interesting because all companies are affected by the megatrends, and you can derive from that certain risks, but also certain opportunities. And you have to think about, okay, where. Again, please remember, in a strategy, you don't do everything, so you have to focus on a few things where you work proactively for. And it can be risks or opportunities, both. So let's quickly go on. We are still in the market-based view, so it's an external analysis. The most famous model is the pestle analysis developed by Porter. And you have here 6 areas, so political, economical, social, cultural, technological, ecological, and legal. And all these overall trends, mega trends, or shorter trends in this, also short-term trends in this area, they affect all companies themselves similarly. And how you do that, you see that on the right-hand side. So you have, first of all, you here, for example, it's only 5 areas, right? So we had 6 areas from pestle, but 2 are combined. But it doesn't matter whether it's 5 or 6. If you want to combine 1 or 2, you can. The most important is that in every area you have to define indicators. So, for example, underneath political, you have political, so you have government stability, regulatory environment, policy consistencies, and so forth. And all of these indicators, they are not fixed. So every company has to decide in this area what is most important to them, and then define these criteria first of all. Then if you go to the right-hand side, for example, government stability with 20%, regulatory with 50%. So second step, you define the weight. So what is in the across these indicators more or less important. So more important, you give it a higher weight. And then all these areas add up to 100%. But also overall, all these major groups add up to 100%. And then as a next step, you define, for example, governance stability. You can define your own axis, maybe from 1 to 5. And 5 is really, really solid, and 1 is really, really unstable. And then you say, okay, maybe it's 2.0. And then you do that for all criteria. And then at the end, you have, after the assessment, an overall weighted number. So for example, the number could be 2.5. And the question is, what do you do with that value, right? So it looks quite intuitive. Okay, you look at everything, but then you have this calculated value. And often students ask me, okay, what do you do with that? So what is most interesting is if you have two columns. The first column is maybe a historical or a current column, or maybe the status quo or the state or the trends of the last 2 or 5 years. And then you have a second column with the outlook, so the perspectives, a future perspective of the next 2 to 5 years. And then it becomes interesting, because if something is decreasing or increasing, you can say, okay, maybe this is an opportunity for me, or maybe this is a risk for me. And again, you have to decide proactively which kind of elements do you want to focus on. All right. So for example, here, if you look at political stability and you look at the regulatory environment, the regulatory environment could also be part of legal, actually. And legal, you see, is not a separate area here. So political stability actually includes legal here in this case. And if you look at the regulatory environment, for example, for Sonax, then, for example, there could be some chemical regulations if certain materials will be in the future most likely forbidden. And then this could be a major risk. And this could be something you focus your strategy on. So this could be an outcome of this analysis. All right, then we go one step further. We are still in the external view, so we still look at the market, and we go from the past analysis looks at the environment, at the industry, or cross industry, so the macro environment. And now you look at the micro environment. So micro means, okay, your direct competitors, so the direct elements of the market. And here you see the 5 forces. So you have suppliers, customers, competitors of today, competitors of tomorrow, and eventual replacement products. So what does that mean? You look at all areas and you see again here the 5 areas, and you can define certain criteria. And then you again need to decide on the weights of the major groups and the single criteria. And then you do an as-is and a future score. So you see that here in detail, which is an illustrative way to do it. Again, every company has to define their weights and their assessments and also the criteria themselves. And the logic is, for example, if we look at suppliers, which is number 4, you always think about, okay, do suppliers have a lot of power? Yes or no? So for example, if I don't have a lot of suppliers, then I'm dependent on just a few, so they have a lot of power. If I have lots of suppliers, they don't have much power. Or if I order always tiny amounts, so the volume is really low, then I'm less dependent on the supplier. Or for example, if it doesn't matter, I can tomorrow switch and approach another supplier, then their power is low. If, for example, my whole production depends on only one certain supplier, and I cannot easily switch because it would mean that I have to adjust all of my production steps and it costs me millions of dollars, then I'm dependent on the supplier. So it's not about only the number, but it has quite a lot of elements to it. And you always have to think, okay, does this group have lots of power on me or not? So ideally, I'm in an environment that where no one has a lot of power on me, then I'm free to define my business. And if everyone has a lot of power on me, I have lots of constraints, so I have to think really about exiting the market or changing my positioning so that I get more power. Otherwise, I will not be very profitable. Okay, so this is more or less about Porter's 5 forces. And for example, as a practical example, for example, the e-commerce area, like Amazon, you think about, okay, you may say, okay, they have a lot of power because they have all their logistics centers and it's really costly for others to build the logistics centers. But at the other hand, one can also discuss and say, okay, at the end, it's just a website and it's maybe a major initial investment, but also it's not impossible to rebuild such a logistics infrastructure. But in any case, you need an investment, that's first of all. And second, also the problem, if you have a platform like this, it's really hard to convince people, the customers, to switch. So everyone knows Amazon, and I'm not really likely to change to another platform where you don't have this whole product range and the trust. And the problem, if you don't have a lot of customers that trust you, then you also cannot provide all the warehouses with all the products readily available. So it's a bit of a good positioning of Amazon. Even better is Netflix or Disney. If you have a lot of rights on certain or license rights on certain movies, then you can exclude others from the market. At the same time, also, that's why Netflix also moved into own production. So if it's my production only, then I can just decide not to sell it to anyone else. And if my productions are the most interesting, then I can keep my customer base easily. So this is more or less quickly on Porter's 5 forces. And we move to something that is called benchmarking. Here again, you can read through this comic and reflect what it wants to tell you. So what does it tell you, actually? It tells you that benchmarking, I think, is one of the things everyone does. It's always interesting. While I did management consulting, we always did benchmarks. This is also why you pay millions and millions, so our fees were really high. But we had the data from all competitors, and they didn't have access to that, and we could show them where they stand. So everyone was always interested in benchmarks. But of course, with benchmarks, depending how you select your sample, it can show that you're really good or bad. So it always depends. You have to really be careful when you look at benchmarks. And here you see a typical example on the left-hand side. And this is also like we are now in between the internal and external view, because of course you can do a benchmarking of you and the competitors. That will be an external benchmarking. But you can also do an internal benchmarking. For example, you can do the gross margin from all product groups, or you can do the cost efficiency of different teams in your company. So you can do that internally as well. And it's always interesting to see where you stand, because then, of course, where you are worst positioned, you have the certain deficits that you can work on to improve your positioning. Quite similar is also the economies of scale curve or the experience curve. So you can also do that internally, that you always improve your own production efficiency more and more, and so product unit costs are lesser and lesser. On the other hand, you can also do that externally, so that, for example, here I think it's the solar panel costs. So it's a cost per watt of solar energy modules, and you see here also the price, the market price goes down and down and down. It's actually a linear slope downwards. Here you see a regression curve with an R square of 0.95, which is actually almost a perfect line. All right, so this is, as mentioned, economies of scale more internally experience curves, and they also exist externally as well as the benchmarks. And this leads us to the next chapter, which is about the internal analysis. So far we were always focused mainly on external view. And now, if you look internally, there's a very famous concept called RIO. So it's the abbreviation for valuable, rare, inimitable, organized. So if you're not good at any of the four, you really have a competitive disadvantage. If you have something valuable and rare only, then you have a temporary advantage, and you need to organize your competence and to make it imitable, so that no one can copy that, and then you really have a core competence. And one can think about, okay, what is actually a core competence? So for example, if we take Tesla's electric cars, then you can think about, okay, the design of the car, is that easy to imitate? Yes, it is. So this is not a core competence. And for example, the reach, so the range, the kilometers range of the car, is that easy to imitate? Yeah, it is. So it's not a core competence. But for example, if you look at the charging network, the charging infrastructure that Tesla built, so when at former times there were no charging points, or just really, really rarely some charging point, and they built this charging network. So if you wanted to go wherever you want with an electric car, you needed a Tesla, because the others were unable to be charged everywhere. And this charging network is actually one core competence. Or you can think about Coca-Cola, like they had the secret recipe and the brand. So it's rare, it's valuable, it's hard to copy, it's protected or a secret, and they organized that. So this is also a core competence. All right, so we can have now arrived in the internal view. We can use benchmarking. For example, if you do internal benchmarking, for example, Toyota is a nice example, where they really introduced the lean management and tried internally to improve and improve and improve. Or you look at the RIO concept. So you try really to build something unique, a core competence that differentiates you from the others. You can also use this famous value chain analysis again from Porter. So you look at all your production steps. In black, it's written for product business. A traditional one in red, it's added for service business. But you can look at all your critical internal value adding steps, and you can map onto that. Okay, where do I create the most value? Where do I accumulate most costs? Where do I have the best skills? Where do I invest my resources? Where do I really have huge deficits? So you can look at that. You can map all the processes along that chart, and you can review, okay, and really reflect on your strengths and weaknesses internally onto that chart. So you see here on the top, there are the more like the management processes, and then underneath you have the product or services processes. Okay, so for example, a company who really looks at that and is driving that. I also had in my former team a former employee from Amazon, and he really came and he brought all the Amazon leadership principles to my team. And so he was also, it was really, really intuitive for him to look at the processes and optimize and optimize. And this is what Amazon is doing. So they are looking at the whole value chain, all the data, all the IT, all the logistics, everything. And they try really to optimize all the operations. So their competitive advantage is not in the product, but it's really in the system. And they made the system so efficient that it's really, really hard for us to compete with. And that's also why they can keep their customer base, because they also, like, they have so much of profit margin and gross margin, that for them it's easy if some error or some problem occurs with the customers just to give something away for free. So they don't really care about that. So they optimize internally in order to be able to be generous to the customers in order to really drive customer loyalty. All right, and you can also think about, okay, are there certain, in this value chain analysis, are there certain value streams, certain factors, also called strategic success factors, like what are you best at? Why are you different than the competitors? So for example, Amazon, we already said it's really customer centric. They optimize everything for the customer. It's only about the customer. It's not about the employee. But for example, SAP is all about innovation. We have a lot of consumer brands like Nike, Coca-Cola. It's all about the brand. We have a lot of new digital tech companies like Airbnb or TikTok, and there it's all about scalability. Or we have companies, as mentioned earlier, like Google or Netflix. They really focus on talent recruiting, so they pay a lot to really high talent because they say, okay, we need the best people. They deliver the best performance. This is their positioning. And this is also something to think about if you look at the overall value chain. What do you think is the most critical strategic success factor that you want to focus on? All right, so this is all about the analysis. So if you now we think about what did we talk about? We talked about the first about the external analysis, about megatrends, Pestel and Porter's 5 forces analysis, or the benchmarking you can do against peers. This is all about external analysis. And if you already have your project team of 3 people or 4, you can divide up the task and reflect about how to build these analyses. I think that's a really good exercise to do to really apply it to the Sonax case. And then afterwards you can share and discuss your results. So I would say you would need around 40 minutes for that. And then we continue with the next part. All right, then next comes the third step, which is the synthesis and prognosis. So again, where are we? So first we defined with the strategic intent our direction. Then we had 2 parts of analysis. So first was about the external market and competitor analysis, and then second, the internal analysis. And then we have to bring the internal and the external analysis together. That is called the synthesis. And then thereafter, if you have combined that, then you can go into the prognosis that you predict from there what will happen. So combining these analyses, you can use very, very famous SWOT analysis. So I guess everyone knows about that. So I don't really need to comment a lot on that. I think what's important to mention is that you first fill out all the, so as many, you collect as many strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as possible. And then you can, this is on the line below the strategic action, then you can really define what you want to focus on. So you can think about, okay, what would you be your positioning, looking at all of these things. So the external views from the opportunities and threats in the market and from the competitors, and the internal views from your strategic success factors, from your advantages, strengths, and weaknesses. And in red, you already see you can build onto the strengths that you want to do something in order to maintain and build and leverage that. Or for example, you can focus on the threats and say, okay, you have to manage these risks that you will expect. I guess best is to select 1 or 2. Again, if you do everything, then it's not a strategy. It's not really a focus. So try to focus on certain elements rather than saying you will do everything, because you will never succeed in doing everything. All right, then there is something called Taos analysis, and you see we had here the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and they just move onto the side, so that it's the same thing. So the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. And this is a nice way to illustrate, okay, you have here 4 ways to combine 2 elements. And think about, okay, how would be an SO strategy, for example, strengths, opportunities-based strategy. So for example, if we take the example of Tesla, so Tesla's strengths are about the strong brand. They have a good, or had a good battery technology. They had a strong direct-to-consumer sales model. They have also a good software integration, so that's maybe one of their strengths. Then here in the opportunities area, you can put that there's a strong growth in the electric vehicles market. You can also maybe include that a lot of governments provide subsidies and friendly regulations. Then you can also add that the energy storage market is always growing and getting cheaper and easier. And for example, in opportunities, also the increasing experience in autonomous driving. So this potential also is getting better and better. So one of the strengths and opportunity-based strategies could be that you scale your battery production to dominate the electric market, or you can leverage your brand to expand into the energy ecosystem. So it's a solar and storage business, what they actually tried. Or you can use your software leadership to accelerate the autonomous driving. So this would be 3 examples what you could do. And yeah, and then you have to select, okay, will you do everything, or what is actually the most interesting strategic action that you want to focus on, and you write that on in the line below. So again, Tao's analysis is bringing all the 4 aspects from the SWOT together and then always combining it into these 4 strategic fields, and then you have to discuss which of these fields are most interesting, or which of the elements into these fields are most interesting. And then this is kind of a strategic action that you already selected. All right, then next, if you defined more or less what's interesting, where the most strategic potential lies within, then you can also review what are all kinds of risks. So, for example, there's this very nice visual risk analysis approach. It was derived from an article from Taleb, Walker, and Milton. And it became quite famous that these 3 approaches and metaphors were combined. So black swans are quite rare to see. They are unpredictable with a high impact. So if you think about risks like that, then you have, for example, the financial crisis in 2008, typical example for a black swan risk. Or for example, the COVID pandemic is also a typical black swan scenario. No one had seen COVID coming, and this is a black swan. Then you have rhinos. So rhinos are not so rare. So you know that they are there, but they are as a metaphor for something that is quite likely but still ignored. So in the real world, a rhino is, for example, the aging of society, or the climate change everyone knows about, our climate difficulties, but no one is doing something about the extreme weather that we are going for. Then thirdly, there's the silver linings. Silver linings means something positive. You see here there was maybe a thunderstorm, you see the clouds, but then there's the sun shining through the clouds. So the sun is a metaphor for the hope. So if anything of negatively comes towards you, if you go through a crisis, then at the end there's always hope, or there's something positive out of that. Good examples are, again, the COVID pandemic. So through the pandemic, a lot of companies introduced remote work, and lots of people still think today that's the best that could have happened. Or for example, another example is that we still have some climate fear, and so we have a lot of solar energy subsidies stemming from that, which is also good. So you can collect all of these risks and map that, and another alternative way is here sketched on the right-hand side. So you can also think about, okay, certain risks, how likely are they to happen and how severe are they, and then you can match that, and then of course If I have something that is very probable to happen and really impacting me heavily, then I'm in the red zone. And these risks I have to address immediately. Also in my strategy, the orange ones then next, and then the yellow ones, the blue ones, and the dark turquoise ones at the latest. So think also about that, not just about strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, but also think about the risk and the severity of the risk that you need to tackle. Also for the prognosis part, a really nice way is the picture of the future. There's lots of companies who are doing workshops with their top managers, and they first talk about all kinds of trends and things, and then they give the task to sit down and really visualize how could the future look like. And for example, there is an engineering company for the textile and the automotive industry, and especially they do machinery for the textile industry. And for example, they had a picture of the future where they said, okay, maybe in 20 or 30 years you have your clothes, and if you don't like them anymore, you bring them into a kind of copy shop close to you, where all the fabrics go into a kind of mixer, so they are really chopped up and put into really tiny pieces, and then they will be soaked with water, and then from that, with some chemicals, will be made new clothes in the form that you want to have, and you can also select a logo. So if I want to have for example, a Gucci suit, then I can put that label onto that. So they were thinking, okay, it's a really interesting idea that fashion is not just there in the store, but you can design your own fashion yourself, and you can print and produce it individually just next to your house in the next shop. So this is kind of a future vision. Other companies, like here you see, they have a lot of drones, and still trucks are driving around. There's some productions units. There's some planes. Yeah, whatever that means. But the idea is really about visualizing something and then detailing, okay, what are key elements onto that? And then you can collect from that group, okay, what is actually interesting for your future vision. All right, next is typical scenario planning. You can do that quite traditional, that you say, okay, the x-axis is the time, and the y-axis, the vertical one, is performance. So traditionally, performance is measured as profit or sales or number of customers. But you can also use a sustainable performance scale, that you say, okay, your performance is, for example, the amount of CO2 emissions, or for example, employee satisfaction or water consumption. Could be also impact on species and many, many more. So these scenario analyses are very, very important, because if you have a certain vision or a certain strategy that you derived from your synthesis here, then this would be your normal trend scenario, but always you have a worst and a best case scenario, and the expected outcome will be then anywhere in this area. And so you need to be aware of, okay, again, we just collected here all the risks, and if everything happens, then this is the worst case scenario. And if you underestimated certain things, then you have your best case scenario. So this is also quite interesting to see, okay, your strategic ideas where does that end up? And then you can discuss, is that interesting to you, yes or no? Here you see, for example, a scenario by Shell. Shell is quite famous case. So already in the 70s, they understood that climate change will come and will affect the whole world significantly. So they understood that much earlier than the competitors. There are studies from the 80s where they predicted sea levels at that time that are almost exactly matching the whole development until now, which is quite impressive. So what's implied there is that they already knew no one will do anything against climate change. So they always called this scenario business as usual. And actually, yeah, this is what happened. So they are good at predicting reality. All right, and here you see, for example, 3 scenarios they did. Then later on, so this is a quite new study from a few years ago. So they have these 3 scenarios, which are different to the degree of CO2 capture and the carbon capture potential. And you see here a 1.5, a 2.5, and a 2.3 degree scenario. And so the 1.5 is called Health First. So it's also entitled Sky Scenario. So it's really about being sensitive to public well-being. It's really about people and society, but also about the environment, and that you really want to reach the Paris Agreement of accelerated decarbonization. So it's all about managing emissions, exiting coal as energy supply. And you see here, if you exit there immediately, then you have a lot of good impacts. But also we know it never happened. And so they already calculated, okay, what is the Wells first example, or that you to just act quite late, but then you act, or you act slow, then you arrive at 2.5, and I guess we will be even over 2.5. And it's quite interesting. So you see also the more in detail analysis on the right-hand side. That's all the elements that lead up to this calculation. So this is something you can do to whatever trends affect your business model in order to know better and analyze better the environment and understand better what could happen. So again, exercise for you would be to come together with your team, divide up the tasks. So someone can do the task analysis, someone can do the picture of the future, some can develop a scenario plan, just really to get familiar with this kind of strategic thinking. And you just learn whenever you do these things. So just try it and put yourself into the shoes of Sonax from whatever you know about it, the company yet, and try to sketch these strategic analyses. And then, of course, again, discuss that in your group. Okay, so this was part 1, which is the actually first part of the strategic cycle that I wanted to lead you through. What I added, I mentioned that at the beginning, I want also to do a first introduction to sustainable chemistry for you, so that we get more familiar with the context that Sonax is operating within. So first of all, let's look at the chemical industry. So you see here a chart that is showing the chemicals sold in the European Union by product group in euros, in billion euros. And you see here leading is the medical and pharmaceutical products. That is, of course, not the business model of Sonax. So if you look at the other groups here, you can check where would you group or where would you assign Sonax? What do you think is the industry area that they work with? And if you look through all that, you will see quite quickly, I guess, it's about chemical materials and products. This is where I would classify them, that's the third group. All right. And here you see quite already a lot of regulations. There are many, many more. But here just some few of them. So I guess three are most important. The REACH classification, the first line, it's really about controlling the risk of the chemicals. Then the second is a CLP. It's about communicating the risks. It's about the labeling, which is also really important and critical for Sonax. And then almost at the end, it's called the Waste Framework Directive. We have here already the regulation then that we will talk about later on, which is following this directive. All right, so let's go into REACH. What is meant by REACH? So REACH is an abbreviation. You see here on the left-hand side, its first step is the registration R, then E stands for evaluation, A stands for authorization, and then you say REA, so the CH stands for chemicals. So that's what the abbreviation stands for. And so you see here there are certain hurdles. So I need to register everything. Like if I produce small amounts, I don't have to register. But if I produce more than 1 ton per year, I have to. And if I have more than 10 tons per year, or if it's a substance of concern, then I also have to evaluate that. And if it's a substance of very high concern, then I also need authorization before I use it in the market. So authorization, you see that here also on the right-hand side, what do I need to authorize? I need to authorize carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic reproductional elements. So the CMR elements, they are really, you have often a direct exposure through inhalation, through the skin, or through ingestion. So for example, part of the CMR group are benzene, so petrol, gasoline, or other industrial chemicals. You have formaldehyde in furniture, flooring, or textiles. For example, you have thalidomide in the pharmaceuticals. So this is all things that need authorization. Then next you have the PBTs. So they are the persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals. So they are normally released into the environment and they accumulate normally in animals. And so we also absorb these materials through our food. So part of that are, for example, DDT, which is included in pesticides, or for example, PCBs that are included in sealants or electrical equipments. or there's many other also toxic chemicals, for example, that accumulate in fish and seafood that belong to that category. Then you have these PVBs, very persistent and very bioaccumulative chemicals. One thing that I think everyone already heard about is PFAS, so PFAS. So this is included in the non-stick cookware, in waterproof clothing, also in food packaging, which is really not, it's called very persistent because it's even less degradable than plastic, so it will stay for hundreds and thousands of years. So it's really a problem because it accumulates more and more into our environment, and it has really also severe health effects of cancer and other really serious diseases. So this is not only PFAS, but also there's a group called PFOS. Then there is also fluorinated surfactants, for example, in firefighting foams. These are already, I think, prohibited, but in many other areas, PFAS chemicals are still allowed, and this is really problematic. So I guess I will also provide you a link to a movie. If you don't know yet about it, then you can watch the movie whenever you have time. It's quite interesting to see. Then, of course, there is an association called European Chemicals Agency, and they maintain these lists of all the chemicals. So people say that more or less today 23,000 of substances are registered, and around 70 groups are banned. Some people state that only 70 out of 23,000 substances are banned, but it's not right. So it's about 70 product groups, which are about 1,000 single substances that are banned, which is around 4%, which is not a lot. And if we think again about Sonax, then of course one can assume maybe they don't manufacture cookware, so I guess, I'm not sure, but I guess it's quite unlikely that they use PFAS, so VB substances. But in any case, I'm sure there's some kind of product potential in about, for example, eliminating harmful stabilizers or harmful dyes or microplastics. I'm quite sure that we may find some potential to make the product itself more sustainable. Okay, so it's really about the REACH. Again, it's really about defining, is that allowed or not allowed? Normally I have to register, and big volumes I have to evaluate, and eventually, if toxics, also to authorize. And this applies really for manufacturers like Sonax. So they have the responsibility to register and to comply with REACH. So you see that also in the data sheets from all the products, you see the relevant REACH information. And it also, of course, applies to the distributors, the retailers of Sonax products, but they don't have to register. They have minor, less potential obligations. All right, so far about REACH. So let's see how it looks like here. You see a wild graphic here. lots of chemical illustrations, but it's also quite, I guess, cute to look at. You see here the development from chemical production from year 2004 to 2020. And if you look at the overall hazardous and non-hazardous production, you see it's more or less 300 to 60 to 90 to 80 to 90, almost to 90 again. So it's quite stable over time, quite interestingly. So it's not that we get less dependent on chemicals. It's a quite stable industry. But what is quite shocking, if you look at that, then you see that we have 221 million tons in 2020 that are hazardous to health. That include also 79 million tons hazardous to the environment, that is then indirectly also hazardous to our health. But if we look at the total of 284, and we have a share of 221 that are hazardous, then it's almost 80% of the chemicals today used that are hazardous to our health, which is quite shocking. So hazardous means really hormonal health risks. It's about well-being, it's about reproduction, it's about serious diseases up to cancer. So it's quite shocking that we produce so much of health risks. So I guess one of the SDGs, it's about the health, and you see that the chemical industry may not be one of the main contributors to our health, and we should really reflect on, okay, how can we make our chemicals more sustainable, more actually healthier, right? Okay, got the first impression. Next picture we see here again, it's just a different way how it's illustrated, but it's still, we had in 2020 284 as overall production, and thereof 221 of hazardous chemicals to health. So this is actually what is shown here. And here you can see the split into 5 groups of hazardous intensity. So the yellow top group is only harmful, and the lowest area is most toxic. So you see here again, it's a CMR group. Actually, this is one that we just looked at that that are included in the substances of very high concern. And you see here we still have around 30 to 50 million tons of CMR production every year. So the good thing is that you see here it really got less, which is good, but it's still a quiet, stable block, and we should tackle this. All right, next to that, so we talked so far about REACH. It's about the evaluation and the authorization of hazardous chemicals, which are a big share. And then it's next, I would like to talk to you about the extended producer responsibility called EPR. EPR is also one of the major frameworks. So it was initially introduced by the OECD, so globally. Then it was also translated and defined by the EU, and then also defined on a national level. And for example, in August 2026, so this summer, national law in Germany will mandate the EPR for the packaging's entire life cycle. And it will, so the packaging was one of the first categories that were here mandated, but it will step by step also be widened. And then over time it will there will be also some follow-up regulations, like the Circular Economy Action Plan is coming up, the Eco Design Regulation is coming up, and also the Digital Product Passport. So right now we have a focus on the packaging EPR, but very soon we will have a full product responsibility. So what is actually meant by extended producer responsibility? So a producer is not only responsible for the own production and the sales, but it has an end-to-end responsibility from raw materials to consumption and the end of life. So over the entire cycle, it's important to review and to optimize the product. There's also fines and fees to be paid, fees especially, so you have always to register your product and your product packaging especially. There's a LACIT register in Germany. You have to say which kind of volumes with which kind of materials you will sell, and then you pay the according fees. And you have also to stick to certain recycling target depending on the material. This is not so easy because recycling does not never work at 100%, and also depends on the material. But there's quite a lot of a shift included there, because so far people looked at the product only, and now you really have to focus on the entire cycle. And especially today there's the focus on packaging and that's why also our project work will focus. Some teams will have full product optimization project work, and some teams will have a packaging optimization project work as their term paper work. So packaging, there's already some older regulations like the Packaging Act, but now we have the EPR starting in August 2026. And we look at the PPWR also in just a few minutes. All right, so we understood what the EPR is. It's today mostly about packaging. So let's look at how packaging looks like today in the European Union. So here we see a chart over the last 11 years from 2011 to 2022, and you see the kilograms of packaging per person per year. What's quite interesting is that if you sum it all up, all these bars, then you see that we have an increasing packaging waste that is generated by person. And for example, you see the two lines here, it increased from 155 kilograms per person in 2012 to 189 kilograms in 2021. And this is although there is such a big increase. And that is also why the regulator said we need to do something about the packaging. Everyone now can take a quick second and think about it. What do you think is most sustainable and what is the least sustainable packaging? What do you think? Okay. So maybe some of you thought paper is the most sustainable, right? But it's not necessarily cardboard or paper is not necessarily the most sustainable, because it's quite heavy. So if you need to think about the emissions for transport, for shipping, or for air transport, for the road transport, it's really about weight, and cardboard is really heavy. Then it's, of course, also sensitive to moisture. So for a lot of products, it doesn't really work. So it's not really always the best. But you see here, it's about 2/3 of our packaging waste. So we use it really, really a lot. So one could also ask him or herself, why do we use so much paper, and why is the packaging waste growing and growing? So just reflect by yourself quickly about that. And actually, it's the reason why, there's actually two reasons. First of all, Um, it's um, it's really about e-commerce. So if you think about all these, the shopping you do online, that is delivered, everything is in cardboard delivered. So it's called distance trade. Um, and then the second major component is about the single person households, right? So previously there were big families, and you bought huge packages because the whole family easily finished or needed these higher volumes. But now with the single person households, everything is in tiny packages, and of course then the smaller the packaging size, the higher the packaging waste per person. So these are the two trends. That's why it's piling up and piling up. Um, and actually, if you think about it, today it's more than 210 kilograms per person. So it's more or less half of that is industrial waste. So it's not ending up directly in our households. And the rest of that is mostly food. That's why a lot of packaging experts focus on food packaging. But of course, also other products are included in the overall packaging, like the car products from Sonax. So we will focus on Sonax products. And we will also reflect on, okay, is that wisely? For example, I guess they have rarely anything in glass. This is more food packaging, the glass. Um, and many think also, next to the cardboard, glass is really the most sustainable, but it's often the least sustainable, especially if you have single-use glass, and it's so energy intensive, the melting process, that a single-use glass is often really the worst option. So it's really, we have to think about how to decrease the packaging per person. And there is not a general rule that you can follow, so we really have to decide individually what is the product, how are the options, what can we do, and of course also reverse logistics systems develop more and more. So it's quite interesting to check everyone in a while to see, okay, do I have anything that I can do to optimize the packaging? If you think about something that is not sustainable, then maybe lots of people say it's plastic. You see that is here this beige light brown color. If we go to the next page, you see the plastic packaging. Um, and it's quite interesting if you see the global plastics use. Here it's a really nice graph because it goes from 1990 to 2060. And you see here at the bottom, the very light um, blue shade is the plastic packaging. And you see really that the global plastics use is driven by plastics packaging. So a lot of people also focus on this plastic packaging, and you see here on the right-hand side, it increases and increases per person because of course it's very lightweight. It's quite interesting for the emissions and the product weight to use plastics. And also the recycling share always increases. Also the overall plastic packaging waste increases. So let's think about the recycling share. Sorry, if we go back, how big was it? It was about, yeah, it's a bit difficult to see. It's a bit less than 50%. Let's say it's about 40%, which is quite interesting and quite high already, the recycling share. Because you see here we have this typical loss cascade. So in every step of recycling, through collecting, sorting, and cleaning and reprocessing, you lose a lot of material. And if you do a simple calculation and say in every step you lose 10%, then you need to collect 3 times the amount of the material to have 100% of recycled content. So going back, for example, if this would be the right calculation, then actually the recycled is a lot higher because we have to collect 3 times the green bar to have this tiny green bar. And if we add that always on top, then you see the plastics always increases a lot. And you have to take that into account. And you see here also at the bottom the typical loss ranges. So collecting, you lose a lot of material because some don't bring it to the recycling facilities. Then second is about the sorting. It's really not trivial. So sometimes you have mixed materials. So for example, multi-layer packaging. Sometimes it's also contaminated. So for example, if you have rests of food on it, you cannot really use it. Or if you have labels onto that or additives, you cannot use that. For example, a yogurt cup with a sleeve and some glue and some food residuals, that is often not recyclable in practice. So depending on the collection, it can be also a sorting problem of 40 or 50%. These are just some typical drivers, and the sorting is really one of the major loss drivers. And then there comes the reprocessing. So in the reprocessing, it's really about that I actually know materials remains the same. So if you reprocess cotton a few times, you cannot use it anymore. If you reprocess also polymer chains, they degrade. Also more and more additives accumulate. So it's really the material quality decreases and decreases, and you have as a result mostly not really a true recycling, but more a downcycling. So generally one can say a material stays in the system, but it's not the same quality, but an inferior quality. And normally you can say if you really focus on, you can keep 40 to 70% of the collected materials at one step. But then again, if you lose every time, again, we have to add up the collected materials in order to get the desired recycled volume. And that may be shocking, but for example, there are numbers from the OECD that say that only about 9% of plastics globally are recycled. So we really need to increase that because plastics is one of the, or certain plastic materials are quite easy to recycle. And in the European Union, the circular material use is only about 12%. These are numbers from the EEA, though the actual numbers are always quite low. And so we really need to think about reduction, also redesigning products for recyclability, introducing reuse models, and improving our collection, sorting, and reprocessing systems. Because we know recycling doesn't solve the problem, so we need to tackle the challenge from different angles. Okay, we already talked about plastics recycling. So here on the next page, you see a lot of different plastics, and there are these codes that maybe you have already seen on the products. So there is typically, you refer to these 7 codes. So the PET bottles, that's the typical water bottles. They are really easily recyclable. Then in group 2, there's the HDPE plastics, and this is actually the 2 major plastics category for Sonax. Otherwise, there are still a few others that are, you see, some are really rarely and difficult to recycle. And I guess what is important, for example, PETE or PET is always more or less, we can use that as a synonym. It's always the same or practically the same. And what is the most important is that we really need to avoid different plastics that are combined, because then also if the different layers would be recyclable, if it's one product, it cannot be recycled anymore. All right, then let's go next to the fees. We already mentioned those, the EPR fees. So you have to register at Lucid and then tell them the weight, and you have a certain price and the volume of the material, and then it gives you the price you need to pay. So there is a lot of providers for the packaging license fees. So we have in Germany, for example, the green dot, the grüne Punkt. We have also other providers like Interzero, Bella and Vision, Veolia, Reclay, Centec, and others. So you have to use one of those providers of, it's called the dual system. So you select one and then you make a contract with them, and then they provide you the typical fees of euro per kilogram. So that's why there are ranges. It's not a predefined price defined by the government, but every provider sets their prices according to their capacities and their needs. And then you have a contract with your provider, and it doesn't matter where they sit, you just declare the volumes and you pay, and that's it. And these providers, they use these fees in order to manage the system. So they use that to finance the collection, so the waste collection systems, the sorting facilities, the contamination handling, the recycling, the administration and the reporting. So you just pay, and you know that the packaging waste or also the whole product waste is taken care of. All right, so that's how the system works. And if you look at the numbers, you see, wow, plastics is most costly, and glass and paper is the cheapest. But the problem is also paper and glass is really heavy, and plastics is really lightweight. So more or less it's the same. It's not so much of a difference. So you need to also take care of a lot of other elements, like about emissions, about transports, about also product stability, durability, and so forth. So you think about all the factors, not only the EPR fee, when designing your packaging. All right. Then last but not least, I quickly want to tell you about the packaging and packaging waste regulation. So it's a PPWR regulation I already mentioned before. So it's really, really quite new, and it has a lot of requirements by 2030 that you need to think about. And it's quite a revolution, because so far the packaging was more or less done, okay, for the transport, for logistics, but also for marketing. And this new regulation requires that you really rethink your packaging. It's part of a regulated system element, so you have to think about an eco design rather than a marketing product instrument. And the difference, for example, if you have a food product, then most of the CO2 footprint is normally from the food. But if you have a chemical product, then the CO2 footprint per liter is it's quite low, but the packaging footprint is quite high. So packaging plays a quite or relatively more important role in the chemical industry than in others. So it's one of the main sustainability levers. And you see here, that's the first point, recyclability. You have to think about how do I redesign my product to make it recyclable by design. And second, you need to have recycled quotas. So you have by 2030 mandatory minimum levels, and so for PET, it's minimum 30%, HDPE it's 25%, others it's 15%. The question is, why is that so high for PET plastics? And the answer is, of course, it's so high because it's quite lightweight. And of course, it's also especially high volume. So most of the plastics are PET, and that's the major criteria. It's easy to recycle. So the ease of recyclability resulted in such a big quota of 30%. All right, so this is about the recycled share. Then, of course, you're supposed always to minimize the weight and the volume, so no overpackaging your product. You should also rethink about reusing and refilling. And it's also about the labeling, and this is really, really important about the labeling. So, for example, if you have a PET bottle but a PVC label, so you have different plastic materials that are attached to each other with a glue, and this is then non-recyclable. So you need to avoid these combinations. So the label and the packaging has always to be the same material, otherwise you destroy your recycling shares. So this is quite fundamental. And here you see also some implication for Sonax. So it's really about changing product and packaging to become a monomaterial material choice. And to think about the impact of the emission impact of the packaging, and really have it in a mono material with the labeling, and also see whether you can do more refill or reuse systems. So the question is really, a bottle PET and label of PVC is the entire packaging is not recyclable. So really keep that in mind. Also, I mentioned that now the third time. And again, the question is switching from plastic to cardboard always more sustainable? And I guess by now you should know how to answer that. No, of course, it's not always more sustainable because paper is much more heavy, much heavier than plastic. And that's why you really need to be careful. Also, if you have humidity or other barrier properties to think about it, you need to prefer plastic packaging or think about different other materials for packaging. The trade-offs are also really important to reflect on. So, for example, you can say, okay, for sustainability, I do thinner bottles, PET bottles, but then if the bottle is not stable and you have always a leakage and a problem for the retail store, you cannot just optimize that, but get a lot of product problems instead. Also, another trade-off is the recyclability versus the branding. So if I switch to materials that don't look so nice, then I have to see how to adjust that with the label, or I just have to accept that. And the question is also about the recycled materials versus a nice quality virgin material. I have to think that about that not only from a visible point of view, but also from a durability point of view. And I also, of course, always need to take care of the cost. So if a circular product costs me twice as much as a linear product, then maybe the circular option is not an option for me. So you see, there's a lot to be done. We have to do that and start doing that and building onto that. So this is also why your project work is really fundamental in delivering ideas and analysis and providing innovative approaches to to have some progress here onto the 2030 targets. And the question is always, is that easy or is that hard? So some people in the industry say, that's not bad because I always wanted to become more efficient with my resources, to reduce more waste, to automate more. So some say it's easy to have 30%, some say even it's easy to have 50% efficiency gains. And then some also mention that maybe people are willing to pay 10% more. So they are saying that's not a problem if I become more efficient and people pay a bit more. Then also this is a possibility for me to invest my resources into this new system. That's not a problem. Others say it's not so easy, though all these calculations like switching from 500 milliliter to 5-liter canisters is not so easy. So certain customers groups, they will not buy a 5-liter canister. Maybe also the bottle needs to be thicker. And this is really, I guess, always a topic that you need to check on every single individual product in each industry separately. So you cannot just say it that this is an easy challenge. I think most of the companies would even say this is a very costly challenge because most of these efficiency gains are more idealistic and not practical. And at the end, also consumers are not willing to pay up to 10% more. So you see here on the right-hand side a few studies, always more or less 10% or more that is the willingness to for a price premium on more sustainable products. But the willingness, I put that below, is not the actual behavior. I say I would like to do that, but then if I stand in front of that, at the end, most people prefer the cheaper product. So maybe in reality, it's not a 10% premium, but maybe a 1% premium. And if you have to invest a lot and maybe go on to also more costly materials and invest a lot into the recycling of the materials, then maybe it's also an additional cost in total. So it's not an easy challenge, and you really need to be aware of the costs. That's why we will, or you will need to really calculate each material cost increase or decrease, and the production decrease or increase, and the pricing. So please take that into mind. All right. Then last question for today is about the eco labels. So some say, that's interesting if I already invest a lot of time and energy due to the PPWR initiative and making everything more sustainable, then maybe I can also apply to one of the eco labels. So for example, if I have a product and I wrap that for the transport into plastics, then maybe I use a plastic foil that has a 80% recycled plastic share. And then I can put the Blue Angel on top of that. And if the customers see that, then they see, this company is really concerned about the environment. So some of the companies do that, but you see here 80%, and here what we've seen was only 15 to 30%. So the recycled content share and also the chemical restrictions for these eco labels are really high. So one also needs to see, is that easy to get, and do I really have a positive impact through that, or is that only, again, very costly to fulfill these standards, and doesn't matter, though that maybe the customer doesn't pay an additional price premium. So maybe this is not even so interesting for me. So here, just on an illustrative basis, some of the labels. And I hope this was now interesting to you. It's our first step into the world of the chemicals, and I guess one important step to do as a preparation for our project work. So thanks to every one of you for listening with such a patience. And I guess here the exercise is quite easy, straightforward. You can do that by yourself, getting acquainted with the regulations. Again, you can also already join your work team, and everyone looks at a different regulation. You get discuss it together. And so maybe it's more fun and more interesting. You learn more if you do that in a team already. And I guess next time I will already provide you your project tasks. But before that, I really need to know how many people do the retake exam from last year. So how many people already are in the third semester of their studies, and how many are in the first semester of the studies, because I first need that in order to define the project tasks and the work teams accordingly. So I will set up a Moodle survey, and please reply to that and fill that out so that I can also already draft your project tasks accordingly. And then, as promised, we will do the Sonax case together. So we will have one day to go and visit their production. So we will visit two production sites. We will visit the production in Neuburg and the production in Oberhausen, which will be really interesting. Then there will be also one lecture where they will join us and explain us a bit in general and also their strategy. And then they will come another two times. They will join digitally and we will have an online question and answer session with them in order to clarify other details that you haven't found in your other documents. They are also preparing documents for you, so this is all still in preparation, but I will provide to you all the materials in the next week. So first of all, review the strategy slides, review also the chemistry slides so that you get acquainted with that environment. And then we see each other again next Thursday. I'm looking forward to that. Until that, happy Easter to everyone. Have a good time and see you soon. Bye bye.